One of them's a hot chick with big cans and nice legs. Who drew that? You?
She's underage, too.
Yeah, very nice.
Everybody loves the classic Nicktoon, Ren and Stimpy, but there's a dark secret behind it. Something that lurked in the darkness throughout the show's existence and the years after until relatively recently. The beloved cartoon's creator, John K., was a vile predator, and he got away with it for years. The Ren and Stimpy show premiered on August 11th, 1991 as part of a bold, experimental new block of animation on children's cable channel, Nickelodeon. The animation block was called Nicktoons, and it was all about identifying independent animators with singular visions and voices, and giving them carte blanche to produce the types of shows they wanted with minimal studio oversight. The other shows that came out of the early 90s Nicktoons era were Doug, Rugrats, and Rocko's Modern Life, but the Ren and Stimpy show was by far the strangest, most experimental show of the bunch. It was also marred by production issues and controversy behind the scenes for most of the show's first 2 seasons. The show's creator, J KRICFALUSI, or John K., was notoriously uncompromising in his vision for what the show should be and constantly butted heads with Nickelodeon's Standards and Practices Department over questionable material in the show. He was an early 90s pioneer for producing children's animation that didn't talk down to or pander to kids, and instead presented them with strange, extremely violent, often surreal content full of innuendos and mature jokes. The violence and jokes were often highly controversial with both Nickelodeon as well as concerned parents, even leading one episode, Man's Best Friend, to being shelved until years later for its violent content. KRICFALUSI was also an obsessed perfectionist when it came to animation and refused to play by the typical corner-cutting rules of most television animation. Him and his animation company Spumco meticulously hand-animated each second of the first 2 seasons of the show, relying heavily on very intricate compositions, fluid character movements, surreal and often psychedelic sequences with an impressive level of complexity for a cartoon, and the show's trademark extremely detailed close-up shots. Because of this, the show was plagued by delays, and Spumco was often months late in delivering episodes to Nickelodeon for airing. In the end, John K.'s relationship with Nickelodeon became so bad that he would only communicate with them through a lawyer. Ultimately, he and his animation team were fired from the series, and the production of the show was brought in-house without his involvement for the remaining 3 seasons. The last half of the Ren and Stimpy show without John K. no longer suffered from infighting and delays, but lacked the spark of the first 2 seasons. Years later, in 2003, John K. was given the opportunity to revive the show as an adult-oriented series called Adult Party Cartoon on Spike TV. The show featured the same characters and largely the same voice cast and creative team, but instead of being hampered by the restrictions of being a kid's show, it instead was geared towards adults and openly presented crude, X-rated humor. Notably, legendary voice actor Billy West, who voiced Stimpy in the first 2 seasons and both Ren and Stimpy in the last 3 seasons of the Ren and Stimpy show, refused to return for this show because he thought that it was not funny and would damage his career. The show didn't do well and was canceled after 3 episodes. And that was basically the end of Ren and Stimpy's story. It's continued on as a fan favorite amongst 90s kids who long for a less politically correct climate in children's programming, and is always brought up in conversations about how much better cartoons used to be in the 90s. John K. went on to a very low-key career of producing independent animation largely funded by his fans. He's even credited with producing the first ever cartoons made exclusively for the internet. While he worked in TV a few times after Ren and Stimpy, his reputation as difficult to work with and his penchant for missing deadlines largely burned his bridges on the small screen. And that's probably the last anybody other than diehard fans would have heard of him. Except in 2018, 2 women, Robin Bird and Katie Rice, came forward and detailed how, at the young ages of 14 and 15, as young preteens obsessed with Ren and Stimpy, they had written letters to John K. asking for his advice on how to break into the animation industry. He started correspondence relationships with them, at first under the guise of helping them with their careers, but ultimately the conversations turned sexual in nature. Before they, and certainly their parents, were aware, John K. started sexually grooming them.
She used to call me Mr. Falusi, which was very cute. She also sent a videotape of her sitting on the floor in her room, talking to me directly.
That did it. He responded to me. I had just turned 14 when I first heard back from him.
I was falling in love with her letters, and I knew that probably is not right, but I was just so smitten by her personality and her letters.
For both of them, the letter writing eventually became phone calls, which eventually became John K. personally paying for them to fly out to LA so he could help them break into the business. But what ended up happening was far from that. Bird alleges that her and Kay's relationship became sexual when she was only 16. When she turned 17, Kay had her move in with him and she became his girlfriend. Rice alleges that Kay began sexually harassing her, making sexual comments toward her when she was as young as 14. And when she eventually started working for him at Spumco at the age of 18, the sexual harassment happened on a daily basis as a normal part of her working relationship with him.
Hey, this is Katie Rice. She is one of the young artists I was telling you about who sought me out because she grew up watching Ren and Stimpy, right? Mm-hmm. Katie is the princess of sexy girl artists. Katie showed me one time, she drew, I was at her 15th birthday party. We'll tell you that backstory a little bit later. And all the guys that had to follow up on her scenes spent a lot of time in the bathroom, let me tell you.
Both women have several documents from the time periods corroborating these claims, and several people who worked with Kay refer to his sexual harassment as an open secret in the animation industry. Kay was also alleged to possess child pornography on his computer. Though the allegations were eventually reported to the police, they could neither arrest nor investigate Kay because the statute of limitations had passed. In response, Kay's lawyers confirmed that, quote, for a brief time 25 years ago, he had a 16-year-old girlfriend, end quote, but denied that KRICFALUSI's quote-unquote avid pursuit of Rice was sexual harassment, or that he had ever possessed child pornography. KRICFALUSI released an apology to the women and his fans for his behavior, which he said was motivated by undiagnosed bipolar disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as well as quote-unquote poor impulse control. Bird and Rice criticized KRICFALUSI's statement as a non-apology and an attempt to deflect the blame. And that's basically where the story ends. Kay cannot be investigated for these alleged crimes because of the statute of limitations, so he continues to live as a free man, although largely ostracized from not only the animation industry but from society as a whole. Recently, Comedy Central announced a reboot of the Ren and Stimpy show, leading some critics to wonder if Kay would be financially benefiting. However, Comedy Central has released a statement declaring that Kay will not be involved in nor receive financial gain from the show. An important lesson on how you should always fight for ownership and creative rights over the things you create, but in this case, it's probably a good thing.